A single Mediterranean port has become the center of a geopolitical storm. The United States is demanding Greece kick out China. Greece's response? Never. What's really happening at the port of Piraeus, and why is Washington so terrified of it? When American diplomats showed up in Athens last November with a blunt message for the Greek government, they weren't there to discuss ancient history or Mediterranean tourism. They came with a demand to remove China from the port of Piraeus. U.S. officials painted a picture of strategic vulnerability, warning that Chinese control over one of Europe's busiest harbors posed risks to Western interests. They even hinted that American companies could step in, offering what they called a more secure and trustworthy alternative. But Greece didn't blink. The response from Athens was swift and unambiguous. When we were drowning, China threw us a lifeline. We won't betray our friends. This wasn't just diplomatic courtesy. It was a statement rooted in memory, gratitude, and hard economic reality. And it reveals something much deeper than a port dispute. It's a flashpoint in the quiet battle reshaping global trade, influence, and alliances. So what makes this Greek harbor so important that it's become a battlefield between superpowers? And why is the United States willing to risk a rift with a NATO ally just to push China out? To understand that, we need to go back to where this story really begins, not in a negotiation room, but in the wreckage of financial collapse. Piraeus isn't just any port. Geographically, it's a gift. Positioned at the southeastern edge of Europe, it sits closer to the Suez Canal than almost any other major European terminal. That proximity is a game changer. Ships sailing from Asia toward Europe can dock at Piraeus a full week earlier than if they continued north to Rotterdam or Hamburg. A week might not sound like much, but in global shipping, time is money. Fuel costs drop. Delivery windows shrink. Supply chains tighten. For companies moving electronics, automobiles, textiles, and machinery across continents, Piraeus offers something priceless: speed. This geographic advantage earned the port a reputation as the southern gateway of the Eurasian trade corridor. It was supposed to be a logistics goldmine, but by the mid-2000s, Piraeus was anything but golden. Greece's economic troubles didn't appear overnight. For years, the government had been concealing the true scale of its budget deficits. When the deception was exposed in 2005, confidence began to crack. By 2009, the facade collapsed entirely. The global financial crisis hit Greece like a freight train, and the nation's fiscal system imploded. The port of Piraeus, state-owned and underfunded, was crushed in the aftermath. Budget cuts gutted operations. Salaries went unpaid. Workers walked off the job in waves of strikes. Equipment that was already outdated broke down completely, and there was no money to fix it. Container ships would arrive only to find cargo piling up on docks, with no cranes available to unload them. The chaos became so notorious that shipping companies started routing around Greece entirely. Industry insiders had a saying back then: avoid Piraeus unless you have absolutely no other option. The numbers told the story. While ports like Valencia, Barcelona, and Genoa were processing over 4 million containers a year, Piraeus was limping along at just 700,000. The infrastructure was decaying, machinery was antiquated, the layout was a logistical nightmare. There wasn't even reliable nighttime lighting, which meant unloading operations effectively shut down after dark. What should have taken hours stretched into days. A vessel that could be turned around in Rotterdam in half a day might sit idle in Piraeus for 3. Complaints poured in. Equipment failures went unaddressed for weeks. The port authority seemed paralyzed. Piraeus had become a case study in institutional failure. Slow, chaotic, outdated, and prohibitively expensive. When Greece's financial crisis reached its peak, the government had no choice. It needed cash, and it needed it fast. Selling the port seemed like the only option. But here's the problem: nobody wanted it. European investors took one look at the disaster and walked away. Fixing Piraeus would require hundreds of millions in infrastructure investment with no guarantee of short-term returns. It was a financial black hole, and no Western company was willing to jump in. That's when China appeared. In 2009, COSCO Shipping, one of the largest maritime operators in the world, made an offer that stunned the industry. They didn't just agree to lease part of the port, they committed to transforming it. The deal was structured carefully. COSCO paid an initial $57 million for a 35-year concession to operate key sections of the terminal. The remainder of the nearly $1 billion agreement would be settled through revenue sharing, lease payments, and equipment fees over time. It was a hybrid model, part rescue operation, part long-term investment. By 2016, COSCO went even further. They acquired a 51% stake in the entire Piraeus Port Authority for $324 million, with plans to increase that share later. And then the real work began. What happened next is what the shipping world now calls the Piraeus miracle. COSCO didn't just patch up the old infrastructure. They rebuilt it from the ground up. Terminals were expanded. Waterways were deepened to accommodate the massive container ships that define modern global trade. Vessels carrying 24,000 containers at a time. Quay walls were reinforced. New berths were constructed. The outdated cranes that had become symbols of the port's dysfunction replaced with some of the most advanced container handling equipment in the world. Automated logistics systems were installed. Artificial intelligence was integrated into yard operations, optimizing the movement of cargo with precision that human planners could never achieve. For the first time in its history, Piraeus functioned like a truly modern port. The impact was immediate. Shipping giants that had avoided Greece for years, Maersk, MSC, and members of the Ocean Alliance, began designating Piraeus as a primary stopover. Container throughput skyrocketed. By 2020, the port was handling over 5.7 million containers annually, placing it among the top 3 in the Mediterranean and within Europe's top 10. But the transformation wasn't just about concrete and cranes. COSCO didn't stop at the water's edge. They pushed inland, helping develop a sea rail intermodal network that connected Piraeus directly to Central and Eastern Europe. Cargo that arrived by ship could now be loaded onto freight trains and sent deep into the continent, bypassing congested northern ports entirely. Piraeus was no longer just a Greek asset. It had become a logistics nerve center for all of Europe. The economic ripple effects were profound. More than 10,000 jobs were created, both directly at the port and indirectly in transportation, hospitality, and services. Local businesses that had struggled during the crisis suddenly had customers again. Tax revenues flowed back into government coffers. For a nation that had been on the brink of collapse, the port became a symbol of recovery. Today, Piraeus connects with over 100 countries and more than 200 ports worldwide. It's a critical node in trade routes stretching across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, the Americas, and Europe. The port that everyone had written off is now one of the most strategically important maritime hubs on the planet. And that's exactly why the United States wants China gone. The American campaign against Chinese involvement at Piraeus isn't new. It's been building for years, and it's only getting louder. Last November, U.S. Ambassador to Greece Kimberly Guilfoyle made headlines when she publicly called for reducing China's role at the port. She suggested that Washington should step up investment in Greek infrastructure to counterbalance what she framed as Beijing's growing influence. On the surface, her comments were presented as personal observations. But diplomats don't speak carelessly, especially not in front of cameras. Her words reflected a broader strategy coming directly from Washington. From the very beginning, the United States has viewed China's presence at Piraeus with suspicion. The port isn't just a commercial success story. It's one of the flagship projects of China's Belt and Road Initiative in Europe, a highly visible example of what Chinese investment can accomplish. And that visibility is precisely what worries Washington. If more countries see what happened in Greece, a failing port turned into a booming trade hub, they might start welcoming Chinese infrastructure deals with open arms. The narrative that the U.S. has spent years constructing, that Chinese investment comes with strings attached, that it's a Trojan horse for political influence, starts to unravel. Guilfoyle isn't alone in her concerns. Other U.S. officials have echoed similar warnings, repeatedly raising alarms about what they call the risks of Chinese capital controlling critical European infrastructure. The argument goes like this. If China controls key ports and transportation networks, it gains leverage over the continent. And if Europe becomes economically dependent on Beijing, the strategic partnership between the U.S. and Europe weakens. It's a Cold War playbook in a 21st century context. But this isn't the first time the West has tried to derail China's involvement in Greece. The opposition began long before COSCO ever signed a contract. When Greece first announced it would sell operating rights to Piraeus, China's bid was submitted through a completely transparent, competitive tender process. It was a commercial transaction, plain and simple. But even before the ink was dry, European Union officials began raising objections. They argued that strategic port infrastructure shouldn't fall under the control of a non-EU entity. The United States went further. American diplomats approached the Greek government directly, citing vague security concerns, and urging Athens to reject the Chinese proposal in favor of a Western operator. American media amplified the message. Headlines screamed about Greece selling out its sovereignty and China seeking to dominate Europe's gateway. The rhetoric was sharp, dramatic, and completely disconnected from the reality on the ground. Because here's the irony, not a single Western company had placed a serious bid. Europe and the United States were unwilling to invest in Piraeus, but they were perfectly willing to block anyone else from doing so. When Costco sought to expand its stake in 2016, the pushback intensified. Members of the European Commission intervened, insisting that EU infrastructure shouldn't be controlled by Chinese firms. American pressure continued through back channels and media campaigns. But Greece held firm. The government, still clawing its way out of economic disaster, had no interest in political theater. The cooperation with China was delivering results: jobs, revenue, growth. There was no rational reason to stop. The deal went through, and Piraeus kept rising. So, when the United States now demands that China be expelled from the port, Greece's answer carries weight. During our darkest days, China was the one willing to help. We will not turn our backs on our friends. It's a simple statement, but it reflects something the West often overlooks. Memory matters. When Greece was collapsing under the weight of its debt crisis, most of the world looked the other way. Foreign investment dried up. Credit markets froze. The nation was effectively locked out of global finance. Western countries, including Greece's European neighbors and the United States, imposed harsh austerity measures but offered little in the way of tangible support. Greek citizens watched their savings evaporate, their pensions slashed, their futures uncertain. China, meanwhile, acted. While Western investors were dumping Greek bonds, China was buying them. Chinese state entities purchased Greek agricultural products, olives, wine, honey, providing a lifeline to rural economies. Chinese tourists returned to Greece's islands when tourism had nearly vanished. Chinese supermarkets began stocking Greek goods, creating new export markets. And then there was the infrastructure. Beyond Piraeus, Chinese companies invested in Greece's power grid, acquiring stakes in ADME and providing both capital and technical expertise for modernization. They entered logistics, shipping, and terminal supply chains. The investments weren't symbolic. They were structural. Greece knows what happened. The people remember. And the government understands something else, too. The so-called alternative investment the United States is now promising is almost certainly hollow. Washington talks a good game. But words aren't infrastructure. Promises aren't jobs. And slogans don't unload container ships. Replacing Costco at this stage, tearing out a proven operator and inserting a hypothetical American alternative that has never demonstrated serious interest, would be reckless. It would jeopardize the livelihoods of thousands of workers. It would destabilize a critical economic engine. And it would send a message to future investors that Greece's word means nothing. More fundamentally, Piraeus belongs to Greece. It's not a pawn in someone else's geopolitical chess game. It's not a stage for politicians in Washington to grandstand about great power competition. It's a port, and it's working. What's unfolding at Piraeus is bigger than shipping routes or container counts. It's a test case for how nations navigate the new global order, one where economic influence and strategic partnerships are no longer controlled exclusively by the West. For decades, the playbook was clear. If you needed infrastructure, you turned to the World Bank, the IMF, or Western donors. The deals often came with conditions: economic reforms, political alignment, structural adjustments. The terms weren't always favorable, and the results weren't always what was promised. China's approach has been different. It's transactional, yes, but it's also tangible. Ports get built, railways get laid, power grids get upgraded, and the countries involved see results they can measure. That doesn't mean China's investments come without complications. Debt sustainability is a real concern. Transparency in contracting varies. Labor and environmental standards don't always align with Western expectations. These are legitimate debates worth having. But the response from Washington, demanding that countries reject Chinese investment outright without offering credible alternatives, rings hollow. It's not a strategy. It's an objection masquerading as policy. Greece made a choice based on pragmatism, not ideology. It needed help. China offered it. The partnership worked. And now, more than a decade later, the results speak for themselves. The port of Piraeus stands as proof that cooperation doesn't have to follow old scripts. That strategic infrastructure doesn't have to be controlled by traditional powers. That countries in crisis have options, and those options shouldn't be dictated by nations that stood by and watched them struggle. The battle over Piraeus isn't really about a port. It's about influence, memory, and the question of who gets to shape the global economy in the decades to come. The United States sees a threat, Greece sees a partner, and China sees an opportunity to demonstrate that its model, invest, build, deliver, can work where others wouldn't even try. Who's right? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the better question is this. In a world where power is shifting and alliances are being redrawn, what matters more? The promises nations make, or the commitments they actually keep? Greece already has its answer, and it's not changing course. If this story made you rethink how global trade and geopolitics really work, hit that subscribe button. We're digging into the deals, the power plays, and the untold stories shaping our world. One port, one pipeline, one partnership at a time. See you in the next one.